The night was thick with fog, the kind that clung to the air like a shroud, muffling every sound and swallowing the faint glow of the moon. Ravenswood, a small town tucked away from the rest of the world, seemed to hold its breath under the weight of the mist. The streets were empty, the houses dark, and the only movement came from the occasional flicker of a street lamp struggling to pierce the gloom. It was the kind of night where secrets felt closer to the surface, where the line between the living and the dead seemed to blur. And in the heart of this quiet, eerie town, Eleanor Blake stood at the window of her new home, her reflection barely visible in the glass. She was a cartographer, a woman who had spent her life mapping the world, but now she found herself in a place that felt as though it existed outside of any map she had ever seen. Ravenswood was a town of whispers, of stories told in hushed tones, and Eleanor had come here to escape the grief that had followed her like a shadow. But as she turned away from the window, her eyes fell on the old, weathered map she had found in the attic earlier that day. It was unlike anything she had ever seen hand-drawn, with intricate symbols and a destination labeled simply as nowhere. The map felt alive in her hands, as though it had been waiting for her, and as she traced the lines with her fingers, a chill ran down her spine. Because this map was no ordinary map, it was drawn by a ghost. Now turning to Eleanor's arrival in Ravenswood, we find a woman carrying more than just her belongings. Eleanor Blake had come to this isolated town not by chance, but by necessity. Her husband, Thomas, had vanished without a trace 2 years ago, leaving behind only unanswered questions and a void she couldn't fill. The authorities had called it a disappearance, but Eleanor knew better. Thomas had been a man of routine, of careful plans, and his sudden absence felt like a puzzle with missing pieces. Ravenswood, with its quiet streets and shadowed corners, had called to her, a place where she could start over, or so she thought. The town itself was a paradox, both charming and unsettling. The cobblestone streets wound like veins through rows of weathered houses, their windows dark and uninviting. The air carried the faint scent of pine and damp earth, mingling with something else, something faintly metallic, like the taste of a storm about to break. The townspeople were polite but distant, their smiles never quite reaching their eyes. They spoke in hushed tones, their conversations trailing off whenever Eleanor approached. It was as if they were guarding a secret, one they weren't willing to share with an outsider. Among the whispers, one name kept surfacing, the Ghost Cartographer. No one would say much about him, but the fragments of stories Eleanor gathered painted a haunting picture. Decades ago, a man had lived in Ravenswood, a cartographer obsessed with mapping places that didn't exist. His maps were said to lead people to their doom, and he himself had vanished under mysterious circumstances. Some claimed he still wandered the woods, drawing maps that no living hand could create. It was in this atmosphere of quiet unease that Eleanor found the map in her attic. The moment she unrolled it, she felt a strange pull, as though the paper itself was alive. The symbols were unlike anything she had ever seen, twisting lines, strange markings, and a single word scrawled in the corner, nowhere. It was a destination that defied logic, a place that shouldn't exist. Yet, as Eleanor traced the lines with her fingers, she couldn't shake the feeling that this map was meant for her. It was as if the Ghost Cartographer had left it behind, waiting for someone to follow its trail. And so, with the map in hand and a growing sense of determination, Eleanor began to piece together the mystery of Ravenswood. The town's secrets were buried deep, but she was no stranger to uncovering what others had hidden. As the fog thickened outside her window, she knew one thing for certain. This map was more than just paper and ink. It was a key to something far greater, something that might finally lead her to the truth about Thomas and perhaps to the Ghost Cartographer himself. Now turning to the first clue, Eleanor knew that understanding the map's origins was the key to unraveling its mystery. With the strange symbols and the word nowhere burning in her mind, she set out to find someone who could shed light on its history. Her search led her to Mr. Alistair Graves, the town's reclusive historian, a man whose knowledge of Ravenswood's past was as deep as the shadows that clung to its streets. Mr. Graves lived in a small, cluttered house at the edge of town, its shelves overflowing with dusty books and yellowed documents. When Eleanor arrived, he greeted her with a wary expression, as though he had been expecting her. She showed him the map, and for a long moment he said nothing, his eyes tracing the lines and symbols with a mixture of recognition and unease. Finally he spoke, his voice low and measured. "The Ghost Cartographer," he began, "was a man named Elias Blackwood. He lived here decades ago, a brilliant but troubled soul. He was obsessed with mapping places that didn't exist worlds beyond our own. His maps were said to lead people to their doom, and those who followed them never returned. Some say he was cursed, others that he made a deal with forces beyond our understanding. Whatever the truth, he vanished one night, leaving behind only his maps and a trail of unanswered questions." Eleanor listened intently, her heart pounding as Mr. Graves continued. "The map you found," he said, "is one of his last works. It's said to hold a dark secret, a gateway to a place that shouldn't exist. Many have tried to follow its trail, but none have returned. If you value your life, you'll leave it be." But Eleanor couldn't let it go. The map was more than just a piece of paper. It was a connection to Thomas, to the truth she had been searching for. As she left Mr. Graves' house, the weight of his warning lingered, but it only strengthened her resolve. The map was a puzzle, and she was determined to solve it, no matter the cost. With the map in hand and the legend of the Ghost Cartographer echoing in her mind, Eleanor made her decision. She would follow the trail, no matter where it led. The woods outside Ravenswood loomed in the distance, their shadows stretching like fingers reaching for her. She took a deep breath and stepped forward, the map guiding her into the unknown. The journey had begun, and there was no turning back. Now turning to the next phase of her journey, Eleanor stepped into the dense, shadowy woods that surrounded Ravenswood. The air was thick with an eerie stillness, broken only by the faint rustling of leaves and the occasional distant howl that sent shivers down her spine. The map in her hand felt heavier with each step, its cryptic symbols seeming to pulse with a life of their own. The woods were alive with an unsettling energy, as though the trees themselves were watching her, their gnarled branches reaching out like skeletal fingers. As she ventured deeper, the landmarks on the map began to appear. A twisted oak, a moss-covered boulder, a narrow stream that glistened like liquid silver under the pale moonlight. But something was wrong. The landmarks didn't stay the same. The oak seemed to shift its position. The boulder's shape changed as she approached, and the stream's path twisted in ways that defied logic. It was as though the woods were playing tricks on her, bending reality to confuse and disorient. The feeling of being watched grew stronger with every step. Shadows moved at the edge of her vision, and whispers seemed to drift on the wind, though no one was there. Eleanor clutched the map tighter, her determination unwavering despite the growing unease. She pressed on, following the map's directions with a mix of caution and resolve. Finally, after what felt like hours, she emerged into a small clearing. There, nestled among the trees, stood an abandoned cabin. Its wooden walls were weathered and cracked, the roof sagging under the weight of time. The map had led her here, and the cabin was marked clearly, its presence both a relief and a new source of dread. Eleanor hesitated for a moment, her hand trembling as she reached for the door. The journey had brought her this far, but what lay inside the cabin was a mystery she wasn't sure she was ready to face. With a deep breath, she stepped forward, the map's final destination now within reach. The woods had tested her, but the real challenge was just beginning. Now turning to the next challenge, Eleanor pushed open the creaking door of the abandoned cabin, the air inside thick with the scent of dust and decay. The dim light filtering through the cracked windows revealed a room cluttered with old, weathered maps strewn across tables and pinned to the walls. Each map was covered in cryptic symbols and annotations, their edges frayed and yellowed with age. The cabin felt like a forgotten archive, a place where secrets had been buried for decades. As she stepped further inside, her eyes fell on a small, leather-bound journal resting on a rickety desk. The cover was worn, the title barely legible, but she could make out the words, the cartographer's final notes. With trembling hands, Eleanor opened the journal, its pages filled with frantic handwriting and sketches that seemed to shift and blur as she read. The entries spoke of the Ghost Cartographer's obsession with mapping the other side, a realm beyond the known world. His words grew more erratic as the journal progressed, detailing his descent into madness as he tried to chart the unchartable. One passage caught her eye. The door to nowhere lies within these walls. It is not a place for the living, but for those who seek what cannot be found. Beware, for the key is hidden, and the price is steep. Eleanor's heart raced as she scanned the room, her eyes landing on a faint outline in the wall, a door nearly invisible beneath layers of dust and grime. She rushed to it, her fingers brushing against the cold, unyielding surface. It was locked, and no keyhole was visible. As she stood there, a faint whisper reached her ears, so soft it could have been the wind, but it wasn't. The whispers seemed to come from behind the door, a chorus of voices murmuring in a language she couldn't understand. They were pleading, warning, beckoning. Eleanor stepped back, her mind racing. The journal, the maps, the whispers. It was all too much to process alone. With a final glance at the hidden door, Eleanor made her decision. She needed answers, and the town of Ravenswood might hold the key. Carefully tucking the journal under her arm, she stepped out of the cabin, the weight of the mystery pressing heavier than ever. The woods seemed quieter now, as if holding their breath, waiting for her next move. The journey was far from over, and the secrets of nowhere were closer than ever, but so was the danger. Now turning to the next challenge, Eleanor returned to Ravenswood, her mind swirling with questions and the weight of the journal tucked under her arm. The town, once quiet and unassuming, now felt like a labyrinth of secrets. As she walked through the cobblestone streets, she couldn't shake the feeling that the townspeople were watching her, their eyes lingering just a little too long. Her first stop was the home of Margaret Dawes, a reclusive artist known for her haunting paintings. Margaret's cottage was tucked away at the edge of town, its windows shuttered and its garden overgrown. When Eleanor knocked, the door creaked open, just enough to reveal Margaret's piercing gaze. The woman's voice was low and measured as she spoke, her words laced with warning. "You're meddling in things you don't understand. she said. "Some doors are better left unopened." Eleanor pressed for more, but Margaret's answers were cryptic, her tone final. "Leave nowhere alone," she said, before closing the door with a soft but firm click. Undeterred, Eleanor's next encounter was with Edward Hastings, a wealthy businessman who seemed to appear out of nowhere. He was polished, charming, and unnervingly interested in her findings. "Maps, you say?" he asked, his smile too wide, his eyes too sharp. "I've always had a fascination with the unknown. Perhaps we could help each other." But Eleanor's unease only grew. As she left their meeting, she noticed a shadow trailing her through the narrow streets. The feeling of being watched became unbearable, and she quickened her pace, her heart pounding. That night, as she sat in her dimly lit room, the weight of the day pressing down on her, she noticed something slipped under her door, a single sheet of paper. Her hands trembled as she picked it up, the words scrawled in jagged handwriting, sending a chill down her spine. "Leave nowhere alone, or you'll end up like the others." The note was a warning, a threat, and a promise all at once. Eleanor stared at it, the silence of the room amplifying the whispers of the woods, the cabin, and the hidden door. The town's secrets were closing in, and the danger was no longer just a shadow. It was real. Now turning to the next chapter of her journey, Eleanor found herself standing in the dimly lit room, the note still clutched in her hand. The air grew colder, and the faint sound of footsteps echoed in the hallway outside her door. She froze, her breath catching in her throat, as the room seemed to shift around her. Shadows danced on the walls, and then, without warning, a figure materialized before her. A ghostly apparition, translucent and shimmering in the pale moonlight. Its hollow eyes locked onto hers, and it raised a bony finger, pointing directly at the map on her desk. A whisper, faint but unmistakable, filled the room. "Turn back." Eleanor's heart raced, but instead of fear, a fierce determination surged through her. She couldn't turn back now, not when she was so close to uncovering the truth. Ignoring the chill that lingered in the air, she turned to the Ghost Cartographer's journal, its pages filled with cryptic symbols and faded ink. She spent hours poring over it, her fingers tracing the lines of text until she found it a hidden message, almost invisible to the untrained eye. It spoke of a key that could unlock the door in the cabin, and it mentioned the town's old church as the place where it was hidden. The church. It stood at the edge of Ravenswood, its steeple piercing the sky like a warning. Eleanor knew she had to go there, but the thought of venturing out at night sent a shiver down her spine. Still, the ghost's warning only fueled her resolve. She gathered her things, her hands steady despite the fear gnawing at her. As the clock struck midnight, she stepped out into the cold night air, the map and journal tucked securely under her arm. The streets were empty, the town eerily silent, as if holding its breath. With each step toward the church, the weight of the unknown pressed heavier on her shoulders. But Eleanor didn't falter. She had come too far to stop now. The church loomed ahead, its ancient stones bathed in the pale glow of the moon. Somewhere within its walls lay the key, and perhaps the answers she had been searching for. As she pushed open the heavy wooden doors, the faint sound of whispers followed her inside, a reminder that the Ghost Cartographer's presence was never far behind. Now turning to the next phase of her journey, Eleanor stepped into the church's crypt, the air thick with the scent of damp stone and decay. Her lantern cast flickering shadows on the walls, revealing ancient carvings and crumbling tombs. She moved cautiously, her footsteps echoing in the silence, as she searched for the hidden compartment mentioned in the Ghost Cartographer's journal. It didn't take long for her to find it, a small, inconspicuous crevice in the wall, cleverly concealed behind a loose stone. With trembling hands, she pried it open, revealing a rusted iron key and a yellowed letter, its edges frayed with age. The letter was addressed to her, though it bore no name. As she unfolded it, the words seemed to leap off the page, written in a hurried, desperate hand. To whoever finds this, it began, know that nowhere is not a place for the living. It is a realm between life and death, a purgatory for lost souls. Those who enter may never return. The key you hold unlocks the door, but beware, once you step through, there is no turning back. Eleanor's breath caught as she read the warning, but her eyes were drawn to something else tucked inside the compartment, a list of names written in the same hand. Her heart sank as she scanned the page, each name a reminder of someone who had vanished after following the map. And then she saw it, near the bottom of the list, her husband's name. A wave of grief and anger washed over her, but it was quickly replaced by a steely resolve. She had come too far to turn back now. Clutching the key and the letter, she whispered a vow to herself. No matter the cost, I will find the truth. I will bring him back. The crypt seemed to grow colder as she made her promise, the whispers of the Ghost Cartographer echoing faintly in the distance. But Eleanor didn't falter. She had the key, and she had the truth within her grasp. As she turned to leave, the weight of her decision settled heavily on her shoulders, but her determination burned brighter than ever. The next step of her journey awaited, and she was ready to face whatever lay ahead. Now turning to the next phase of her journey, Eleanor made her way back to the abandoned cabin deep in the woods, the rusted key clutched tightly in her hand. The forest seemed darker now, the trees closing in around her as if they were alive, watching her every move. Her heart pounded with a mix of anticipation and dread, but she pressed on, driven by the promise of answers and the faint hope of finding her husband. As she reached the cabin, the air grew heavy, and the faint whispers she had heard before seemed to grow louder, more insistent. She hesitated for only a moment before stepping inside, the key trembling in her grip. But before she could reach the hidden door, a voice cut through the silence. "Eleanor," it said, cold and sharp. She turned to see Edward Hastings stepping out of the shadows, his eyes gleaming with a mix of greed and desperation. "I've been waiting for you," he continued, his voice dripping with malice. "That map, it's mine. I've spent years searching for it, and now you've led me right to it." Eleanor's breath caught in her throat, but she stood her ground. "This map isn't yours," she said firmly, her voice steady despite the fear coursing through her. "It's not about treasure or riches. It's about something far more dangerous." Edward laughed, a harsh, mocking sound. "Dangerous, please. Nowhere is a myth, a legend. But if it's real, it's filled with wealth beyond imagination, and I intend to claim it." The tension between them was palpable, the air crackling with unspoken threats. Eleanor knew she couldn't let him stop her. With a quick, calculated move, she lunged for the door, inserting the key and turning it before Edward could react. The door creaked open, revealing a swirling, otherworldly light. Edward lunged at her, but Eleanor sidestepped, using his momentum against him. He stumbled, crashing into the wall just as the cabin began to shake violently. The floorboards splintered, and the walls groaned as if the structure itself was alive and angry. Eleanor didn't hesitate. She stepped through the door, the light enveloping her completely. Behind her, the cabin collapsed in a deafening roar, trapping Edward beneath the wreckage. The last thing she heard was his enraged scream, cut short as the door slammed shut behind her. And then silence. Eleanor found herself standing in a surreal, dreamlike landscape, the ground shifting beneath her feet and the sky a swirling canvas of colors that defied logic. She had entered nowhere, and there was no turning back. The whispers of the Ghost Cartographer echoed in her ears, guiding her forward into the unknown. Now turning to the next phase of her journey, Eleanor stepped further into the surreal landscape of nowhere. The ground beneath her feet felt unstable, as if it could dissolve at any moment, and the sky above swirled with colors that seemed to pulse with a life of their own. Time itself felt distorted here, stretching and contracting in ways that made her head spin. Every step she took felt heavier, as though the air itself was resisting her presence. In the distance, a figure began to take shape, its form flickering like a shadow caught in the light. As it drew closer, Eleanor recognized the Ghost Cartographer, his translucent figure glowing faintly against the unnatural backdrop. His eyes, filled with a mixture of sorrow and urgency, locked onto hers. "This place," he began, his voice echoing as if it came from all directions at once, "is not a realm for the living. It is a purgatory, a limbo for those who have lost their way. Your husband is here, but so are countless others, trapped between life and death. If you stay too long, you will become one of them." Eleanor's heart ached at the mention of her husband, but the Ghost Cartographer's warning sent a chill through her. "How do I find him?" she asked, her voice trembling. "And how do I leave?" The Ghost Cartographer gestured to the shifting horizon. "The path is not linear here. Time and space bend to the will of this place. You may find him, but the longer you stay, the harder it will be to leave. You must decide quickly, search for him and risk being trapped, or turn back now and save yourself." Eleanor's mind raced. The thought of leaving without her husband was unbearable, but the idea of being trapped in this nightmarish realm forever was equally terrifying. She clenched her fists, her resolve hardening. "I can't leave him," she said firmly. "Not again." The Ghost Cartographer nodded, his expression a mix of admiration and pity. "Then go," he said. "But remember, the clock is ticking, and in nowhere, time is not your friend." With that, he faded into the swirling colors, leaving Eleanor alone in the eerie stillness. She took a deep breath, her eyes scanning the horizon for any sign of her husband. The whispers of the Ghost Cartographer lingered in her ears, a haunting reminder of the risks she was taking. But she pressed on, determined to find the man she loved, even if it meant losing herself in the process. Now turning to the final revelation, Eleanor pressed forward through the shifting landscape of nowhere, her heart pounding with a mix of hope and dread. The air grew heavier, the colors of the sky dimming as if the realm itself sensed her determination. And then she saw him, her husband, standing in the distance, his form faint and translucent, like a memory fading into the void. She ran to him, her voice breaking as she called his name. But when she reached him, she realized he was not the man she remembered. His eyes were hollow, his voice a whisper, as though he were already slipping away. "I can't leave," he said, his words barely audible. "This place, it's holding me here." Eleanor's heart shattered, but before she could respond, the Ghost Cartographer appeared beside her, his presence both comforting and ominous. "There is a way to free him," he said, his voice heavy with regret. "But it comes at a great cost. The map that brought you here is the anchor of this realm. Destroy it and nowhere will collapse, freeing all who are trapped here. But you will be trapped in its place. Tears streamed down Eleanor's face as she looked at her husband, then at the map clutched in her hand. The choice was unbearable: leave him to his fate or sacrifice herself to set him free. But deep down, she already knew what she had to do. With trembling hands, she tore the map into pieces, the parchment crumbling into ash as the realm around her began to dissolve. Her husband's form grew solid, his eyes clearing as he reached for her. "Eleanor," he whispered, his voice filled with sorrow. But before he could say more, the ground beneath her gave way, and she felt herself falling into darkness. The last thing she saw was the Ghost Cartographer, his face serene, as if a great burden had been lifted. "Thank you," he said, his voice echoing as the world around her faded to black. When Eleanor opened her eyes, she was lying in the woods outside Ravenswood, the morning sun filtering through the trees. For a moment, she wondered if it had all been a dream. But then she looked down and saw the ashes of the map still clinging to her hand, a haunting reminder of the choice she had made. The whispers of the Ghost Cartographer lingered in her mind, a bittersweet echo of the realm she had left behind. Now turning to the conclusion, Eleanor made her way back to Ravenswood, her steps heavy but purposeful. The town seemed quieter now, as if the shadows that once clung to its streets had retreated. The townspeople noticed the change in her once restless eyes now carried a quiet resolve, and her movements were slower, more deliberate. The whispers about the Ghost Cartographer, once a constant hum in the air, began to fade, replaced by an uneasy silence. Eleanor decided to stay in Ravenswood, not out of obligation, but out of a newfound sense of purpose. She began to use her skills as a cartographer in a way she never had before. Instead of mapping physical landscapes, she turned her attention to the hidden stories of the town, the forgotten lives, the untold tragedies, and the quiet resilience of its people. Each map she drew became a tribute to those who had been lost, a way to honor the souls who had once wandered the realm of nowhere. As the days turned into weeks, Eleanor found a strange peace in her work. The weight of her sacrifice never left her, but it became a part of her, like a scar that reminded her of what she had endured. And sometimes on quiet nights, when the wind whispered through the trees and the moon cast long shadows across her room, she swore she could still hear the faint, haunting whispers of the Ghost Cartographer, his voice carrying the echoes of a realm that no longer existed. In those moments, she would pause, her hand hovering over her latest map, and listen. The whispers were faint, almost imperceptible, but they were there, a reminder of the choices she had made and the lives she had touched. And though she knew she would never fully understand the mysteries of nowhere, she also knew that her journey had not been in vain. For in the end, she had found a way to bring light to the darkness, even if it meant carrying a piece of that darkness with her forever. And so Eleanor continued to draw her maps, each one a testament to the stories that had shaped her and the town she now called home. And sometimes on those quiet nights, she would smile, knowing that the Ghost Cartographer's work was finally complete, his maps no longer leading to nowhere, but to a place where the lost could finally be found.